Maya Torres stared at the black card in her hands, knowing one swipe could erase the medical debt drowning her family. The billionaire she called to return it didn't thank her. He offered her a job that would either transform her life or expose how little she understood about the price of integrity. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Some people believe that kindness costs nothing, but Maya Torres knew better. Kindness, real kindness, the kind that asks for nothing in return, was a luxury she could barely afford. At 26 years old, working double shifts at the Grandview Hotel restaurant, juggling her younger brother's tuition payments and their grandmother's medication costs, Maya had learned that every decision came with a price tag. She had learned to calculate the cost of a smile, the value of going the extra mile, the risk of caring too much in a world that rewarded only those who could afford to be generous. But on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening in October, when she found a slim black rectangle of plastic tucked between the leather cushions of booth 7, Maya made a choice that would prove that some acts of integrity are priceless, even when you're counting pennies to survive. The Grandview Hotel restaurant existed in that strange territory between elegance and accessibility. Expensive enough to intimidate, but not quite exclusive enough to turn away the merely aspiration. Its chandeliers were real crystal, its linens were pressed daily, and its waitstaff wore uniforms that whispered of old-world service. Maya had worked there for 3 years, ever since dropping out of college when her parents died in a car accident, leaving her to raise her 15-year-old brother, Diego, and care for their grandmother, who was slowly losing herself to Alzheimer's. The restaurant paid better than most service jobs, and the tips from the business lunch crowd and anniversary dinners kept their small apartment just on the right side of eviction notices. On this particular evening, the rain hammered against the floor to ceiling windows with the persistence of someone demanding to be let in. The dinner service was winding down, the last few patrons lingering over dessert and coffee. Maya's feet ached in her regulation black heels, and she could feel a headache building behind her eyes, the kind that came from standing for 9 hours straight and smiling through the exhaustion. She'd already cleared and reset booth 7 twice that evening. The first couple had been celebrating an engagement, giddy and generous with a 20% tip. The second guest had been a man dining alone, distinguished in his late 40s with silver threading through his dark hair and a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than Maya made in 3 months. She remembered him clearly because he had been different from most of the wealthy patrons who dined at the Grand. He hadn't been dismissive or demanding. He had said please and thank you, had asked her name and used it, and had left a tip that was respectful without being showy. He had sat in the booth for nearly 2 hours working on a laptop between courses, occasionally taking calls in a low voice that suggested he was used to making decisions that affected more than just himself. When he left, he had nodded to her, a small gesture of acknowledgement that marked him as someone who still remembered what it was like to be seen rather than simply served. Maya was running a cloth over the table, preparing it for the next seating, even though the restaurant would be closing in less than an hour, when she felt something unusual wedged into the crack where the cushion met the booth's wooden frame. She worked her fingers into the gap and pulled out a credit card. But this wasn't any credit card. It was matte black, heavy, with a weight that spoke of substance. There was no visible number on the front, just a name in understated lettering, Alexander Kane, on the back. Instead of a signature strip, there was a simple phone number embossed in silver. Maya had seen enough movies and overheard enough conversations among the Grandview's wealthier patrons to know what she was holding. This was one of those legendary black cards, the kind that had no spending limit, that was invitation only, that separated the merely rich from the truly wealthy. This was the kind of card that could pay off her grandmother's medical bills with a single swipe, that could send Diego to any college he wanted, that could solve every financial problem that kept Maya awake at night, calculating and recalculating their shrinking resources. She stood there in the soft light of the restaurant, the card heavy in her hand, and felt the weight of temptation. It would be so easy. She could claim she never found it, that it must have fallen somewhere else, been picked up by someone else, or she could use it just once, for the most pressing bill, the one that had a deadline she couldn't meet. Who would know? Who would even care? A man wealthy enough to own this card probably wouldn't notice a few $1,000s. It would change her life, and it would mean nothing to him. Maya looked at her reflection in the darkened window, rain streaming down the glass like tears. She saw a young woman in a crisp white shirt and black vest, a woman whose own mother wouldn't recognize her anymore. Worn down by responsibility and sacrifice. She saw Diego's acceptance letter to the engineering program at the state university, the one they couldn't afford. She saw her grandmother's confused face when she forgot who Maya was, asking for her daughter who would never come. She saw the stack of past due notices on their kitchen table, the phone calls from collection agencies that she had stopped answering. For a long moment that felt like an eternity, Maya stood at a crossroads. She had been taught by her parents that integrity was everything, that you measured a person not by what they did when others were watching, but by what they did when no one would ever know. But her parents had never had to choose between integrity and survival. They had never had to weigh honor against hunger, principles against unpaid bills that threatened to take away the last remnants of their family's stability. Maya closed her eyes and took a breath. Then she slipped the card into her apron pocket, finished clearing the table, and walked to the hostess stand where Christine, the evening manager, was counting receipts. "Christine, I found this in booth 7, Maya said, pulling out the card. "The gentleman who was sitting there earlier must have dropped it." Christine barely glanced up, busy with her calculator. "Did you get his contact information?" "No, but there's a number on the back of the card." Maya held it out. "We should call him tonight. Probably his business card. I'm sure he's already realized it's missing." Christine finally looked up, and her eyes widened when she saw what Maya was holding. "Oh my God, is that what I think it is?" She reached out and took the card, turning it over in her hands with something approaching reverence. "This is an Obsidian Elite card. Do you have any idea what this means? This guy is seriously loaded." She looked at Maya with newfound respect and something else, something that looked like calculation. "You found this?" Maya nodded. "In booth 7, the man who was sitting there for dinner. He must have dropped it when he was getting up to leave." Christine held the card for a moment longer, and Maya could see her weighing options, considering angles. Finally, she handed it back. "You should call him yourself. You're the one who found it. And honestly, a guy with this kind of card, he's going to want to know it was handled with discretion. Call that number, tell him where you work, and arrange to return it to him personally. Trust me, Maya, this is the kind of gesture that gets rewarded. Don't just mail it or have him pick it up from Lost and Found. Make it personal." Maya took the card back, feeling its weight again, now with a different kind of heaviness. This was no longer just about returning lost property. This was about playing a role in a transaction she didn't fully understand, a dance between the wealthy and those who served. She nodded and took the card to the back office, where she dialed the number on the back using the restaurant's landline. The phone rang 3 times, and then a voice answered, calm and controlled, the same voice she remembered from earlier that evening. "And this is Alexander Kane." "Mr. Kane," Maya began, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is Maya Torres from the Grandview Hotel restaurant. I was your server this evening at booth 7. There was a pause, and she could almost hear him shifting mental gears, placing her voice, remembering the interaction. "Yes, Maya, I remember. What can I do for you?" "I found your credit card," Maya said simply, wedged in the booth cushion. "I wanted to call you right away so you wouldn't worry about it." The silence on the other end of the line stretched out, and Maya wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Alexander Kane spoke, and his voice carried a note she couldn't quite identify, something between surprise and assessment. "You found my card," he repeated slowly, "and you're calling to return it. Would you like me to mail it to an address, or would you prefer to come by the restaurant to pick it up?" "I'm here until closing tonight, and I work tomorrow from 11 until 9. Another pause. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "What time is your lunch break?" "I take my break at 3, Maya said. "It's usually quiet then." "I'll see you at 3 tomorrow," Alexander said. "And Maya, thank you for your honesty. It's a rare quality." He hung up before she could respond, leaving Maya standing in the back office, still holding the phone, wondering why those last words had sounded less like a compliment and more like a test. Maya didn't tell Diego about the job offer right away. She needed to process it herself first, to examine it from every angle and search for the catch that surely had to exist. She had learned through hard experience that windfalls came with hidden costs, that nothing worth having was ever simply given, especially not to people like her. That night, after her grandmother had been settled into bed and Diego had retreated to his room to study, Maya sat at their small kitchen table with Alexander Kane's business card in front of her and her laptop open to a search engine. She typed his name and watched the results populate her screen with the digital footprint of a life lived at a scale she could barely comprehend. Alexander Kane was 42 years old, though the photos she found made him look younger. Perhaps because wealth provided access to the kind of healthcare and stress management that poverty denied. He had inherited a modest investment firm from his father and transformed it into Kane Enterprises, a venture capital powerhouse with a portfolio that included everything from tech startups to sustainable energy companies to boutique hotels. His personal net worth was estimated at somewhere between $800 million and $1 billion. The vagueness of the figure itself a testament to the kind of wealth that became difficult to quantify. He sat on the boards of 3 major corporations, donated generously to educational charities, and maintained a reputation for being brilliant, demanding, and scrupulously fair in his business deal. There were no scandals, no ugly divorces, no hidden secrets that investigative journalists had managed to unearth. He was, by all appearances, exactly what he seemed to be, a self-made billionaire who had built his fortune on calculated risks and sound judgment. But it was an article from a business magazine published 2 years earlier that caught Maya's attention and held it. The piece was a profile titled "The Kane Test: How One Billionaire Measures Character Before Capital." In it, Alexander was quoted extensively about his investment philosophy, and one passage in particular made Maya's heart race. "We don't just invest in ideas," Alexander had told the interviewer. "We invest in people, and people are only as valuable as their integrity under pressure. I've walked away from potentially lucrative deals because I didn't trust the character of the founders. Conversely, I've backed entrepreneurs with mediocre business plans because I knew they had the moral foundation to adapt and grow. Character can't be taught, but given the right resources and opportunities, it can build empires." At the end of the article, the journalist mentioned something called the Kane Test, a rumored practice where Alexander would create situations to evaluate a person's ethics before deciding whether to invest in their venture. The details were vague, the evidence mostly anecdotal, but the pattern was consistent. Unexpected challenges, lost valuables mysteriously found, opportunities to cheat or steal that would never be discovered. All carefully orchestrated to reveal someone's true nature. Maya closed her laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, her mind churning. The credit card hadn't been accidentally dropped. It had been deliberately placed, wedged into that booth cushion where only a thorough cleaning would reveal it. Alexander Kane had left it there as bait, as a test, and she had walked directly into his trap. Except it wasn't a trap, not really, because she had done nothing wrong. She had simply been herself, made the choice she would have made regardless of who was watching. But the realization that she had been evaluated without her knowledge, that her integrity had been a performance even though she hadn't known there was an audience, left her feeling exposed and manipulated. She thought about confronting him, about calling that number on the business card and demanding to know if her suspicions were correct. But what would that accomplish? If he admitted it, she would feel justified in her anger, but no closer to understanding whether the job offer was genuine. If he denied it, she would be left with uncertainty and the nagging doubt that she had accused a potential benefactor of machinations that might only exist in her imagination. And if she simply walked away from the opportunity, turned down the job out of pride or principle, she would be punishing herself and her family for his deception, assuming there even was a deception. It was a maze with no clear path. A decision that felt impossible to make with confidence. Diego found her there an hour later, still sitting in the dark, the business card clutched in her hand. "You okay?" he asked, flipping on the light and squinting against the sudden brightness. Maya looked up at her younger brother, seeing in his face the ghost of their father, the same sharp intelligence and gentle concern. She had protected him as best she could over the past 3 years, had shielded him from the worst of their financial struggles, had insisted he focus on school while she worked herself to exhaustion. But he wasn't a child anymore, and she realized she needed his perspective, needed someone to talk her through this decision before it consumed her. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to help me figure out if I'm being given an opportunity or walking into a trap." She told him everything: the black card, the phone call, the meeting at the restaurant, and the job offer that seemed too generous to be real. Then she showed him the article on her laptop, the theory about the Kane test, and her suspicion that she had been evaluated without her consent. Diego read the article twice, his expression thoughtful, and then he sat down across from her at the table. "So you think he set you up," he said. "Left his card on purpose to see what you'd do." "Probably," Maya admitted. "It's too coincidental otherwise." "Why that booth? Why wedged in where only someone cleaning thoroughly would find it?" "He knew I'd be the one to discover it." Diego nodded slowly, processed. "Okay, so let's say you're right. Let's say he was testing. Does that make the job offer less real? Does it make the $90,000 less spendable?" Maya had expected him to be outraged on her behalf, to share her sense of violation. Instead, he was being pragmatic, focusing on outcomes rather than methods. "That's not the point," she protested. "The point is he manipulated. He turned a genuine moment of integrity into a performance for his benefit. It feels like he stole something from me, like he turned my honesty into a commodity." Diego leaned back in his chair, his expression sympathetic but firm. "Maya, I love you, and I respect that you're angry about this, but think about where we are right now. Grandma needs medications we can barely afford. I'm about to graduate, and we both know I can't accept the scholarship to the engineering program because it doesn't cover living expenses, and you can't support all of us on what the restaurant pays. You're working yourself sick, and we're one major emergency away from losing everything. This guy, whether he tested you or not, is offering you a way out. He's offering us a way out. Can we really afford to refuse it because your pride is hurt?" The words stung because they were true. Maya had spent 3 years making impossible choices, sacrificing her own future to secure Diego's and to care for their grandmother. She had learned to swallow pride, to accept help when it was offered, to bend without breaking. But this felt different, more personal. This wasn't accepting help from a social program or a charity. This was entering into a relationship with a man who had already proven he would manipulate circumstances to serve his own interests, even if those interests seemed benevolent. "What if the job is just another test?" she asked quietly. "What if he's hiring me just to see if I'll maintain that integrity in a different context? And the moment I fail, whatever invisible standard he set, I'm out, and we're right back where we started. Except I'll have given up the stability of the restaurant for nothing?" Diego reached across the table and took her hand, his grip warm and solid. "Then you don't fail," he said simply. "You'd be exactly who you've always been. And if that's not good enough for Alexander Kane, then it's his loss, not yours. But Maya, you can't let fear of failure stop you from trying. Mom and Dad didn't raise you to play it safe. They raised you to be brave and honest and to take opportunities when they came, even when they were scary. This is scary, I get that, but it's also a chance to change our lives. Don't throw it away because you're worried about some hypothetical test you might not pass." His words cut through her spiraling thoughts and brought her back to the essential question: what did she actually want? She wanted security for her family, certainly, but she also wanted to prove that her parents' deaths hadn't been the end of her own potential, that she was more than a waitress who had sacrificed her dreams. The job at Kane Enterprises, regardless of how she had come to be offered it, represented a door opening, a path to a version of herself she had thought was lost forever. The next morning, Maya called the number on Alexander Kane's business card. A professional female voice answered, crisp and efficient. "Kane Enterprises, this is Jennifer. How may I help you? This is Maya Torres, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Mr. Kane asked me to call about a position he offered. Oh yes, Ms. Torres, Jennifer said, and Maya could hear the warmth that entered her tone, as though she had been expecting this call, had perhaps been briefed on who Maya was and why she mattered. Mr. Kane left instructions for me to facilitate your onboarding. When would you be available to start? Maya thought about the restaurant, about the 2 weeks' notice that was customary and courteous. Then she thought about Diego's words about not letting fear dictate her choices. I can start as soon as you need me, she said. I'll need to give notice at my current position, but if it's urgent, I can negotiate an earlier departure. Let's plan for 2 weeks from today, Jennifer suggested. That will give us time to process your paperwork and prepare your workspace. In the meantime, I'll email you our new employee handbook and some preliminary reading about our current portfolio companies. Mr. Kane likes everyone on his team to be informed about where we're investing and why. Is the email address you provided on your application correct? Maya hadn't provided an application, but she confirmed her email anyway. Realizing that Alexander had already set this process in motion, had anticipated her acceptance, or perhaps had simply been confident enough in his read of her character to assume she would make the rational choice. Within an hour, her inbox contained a dozen documents, tax forms, direct deposit information, the employee handbook Jennifer had mentioned, and a welcome letter from Alexander himself. The letter was brief and professional, welcoming her to the team and expressing confidence that she would thrive in her new role. There was no mention of the credit card, no acknowledgement of the test if that's what it had been, just a straightforward expression of expectations and support. It could have been a form letter sent to any new hire, and perhaps that was the point, to normalize this arrangement, to treat her as just another employee rather than a special case or a project. Maya gave her notice at the Grandview that afternoon, and Christine's reaction was a mixture of genuine happiness and barely concealed envy. I knew that card was going to change your life, she said, hugging Maya tightly. I'm going to miss you, but God, I'm so glad you're getting out of here. You deserve this. Maya nodded, accepting the congratulations from her coworkers, packing up her locker, and saying goodbye to a place that had been her second home for 3 years. She'd expected to feel more emotional about leaving, but instead, she felt a strange numbness, as though she were watching someone else's life unfold. It wasn't until her last shift, when she was clearing the tables one final time and looked at booth 7 where everything had started, that the reality hit her. She was leaving behind the known, the safe, the predictable, and stepping into a world where she would be surrounded by people who had never worried about making rent, never calculated whether they could afford groceries and medication in the same week, never understood what it meant to choose between pride and survival. She was about to become a stranger in a strange land, and Alexander Kane, whatever his motives might be, was the only guide she had. The offices of Kane Enterprises occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in the financial district, a monument to success built from steel and ambition. Maya stood on the sidewalk outside the building on her first day, looking up at her reflection fractured across 100 windows, and felt the full weight of the distance she had traveled in 2 short weeks. The building had a revolving door that whispered expensively as it turned, a lobby with marble floors that echoed with the click of designer heels, and a security desk staffed by guards in suits that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. She gave her name to the guard, received a temporary badge, and was directed to the elevators that would carry her up to the 32nd floor where her new life awaited. The elevator was mirrored on all sides, forcing Maya to confront her appearance from every angle. She had bought a new suit for this first day, a simple black ensemble from a department store that had seemed professional when she tried it on, but now looked cheap and off the rack, compared to what she imagined everyone else would be wearing. Her shoes were sensible, comfortable, the kind waitresses wore because they had to stand for hours, not the kind of elegant heels that made a statement. She had pulled her hair back in a neat bun, applied minimal makeup, and tried to project competence and confidence. But looking at herself in those unforgiving mirrors, she saw only an imposter, a girl playing dress-up in a world where everyone else had been born knowing the rules. The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that looked like it belonged in an art gallery rather than an office. The walls were a soft gray, decorated with large abstract paintings that Maya suspected were originals rather than prints. The furniture was modern and minimalist, all clean lines and neutral tones. Behind a sleek desk sat a young woman with perfect posture and an even more perfect smile. "You must be Maya Torres," she said, rising to greet her. "I'm Jennifer." We spoke on the phone. "Welcome to Kane Enterprises." Jennifer was perhaps 30, dressed in a cream-colored dress that draped elegantly, her dark hair cut in a sharp bob that framed her face. She moved with the easy grace of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, who had never wondered if she belonged. "Thank you," Maya said, shaking her hand and trying to match her confidence. "I'm excited to be here." Jennifer led her through a door into the main office space, and Maya's first impression was of light and space and quiet intensity. The floor was open-plan but thoughtfully divided, with workstations arranged to allow both collaboration and privacy. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the exterior walls, flooding everything with natural light and offering views of the city that made Maya feel as though she were floating above the streets where she had spent her entire life. The people working at their desks were uniformly young, attractive, and focused, their clothes expensive but understated, their demeanor professional but not cold. They looked up as Jennifer Jennifer and Maya passed, offering brief smiles of acknowledgement before returning to their screens and phone calls. Maya counted perhaps 20 people in total, a small team for a firm of Kane Enterprises' reputation, which she supposed made sense if Alexander truly invested in people rather than just following market trends. "Your workspace is here," Jennifer said, stopping at a desk near the windows, but not too close. A position that suggested Maya was neither at the bottom of the hierarchy nor anywhere near the top. "You'll be working primarily with our portfolio management team, helping to track the performance of our investments and prepare reports for M.R. Kane and the partners. It's detail-oriented work, and accuracy is essential. Mr. F. Kane reviews everything personally, so there's no room for errors." She gestured to the computer already set up on the desk, the nameplate that read Maya Torres in elegant script, and the stack of files waiting for attention. "I've left you a primer on our current portfolio companies," she continued. "I'd suggest familiarizing yourself with those first. We have a team meeting at 2 this afternoon where you'll be introduced to everyone officially. Till then, feel free to get settled and don't hesitate to ask questions. My extension is on your phone." Maya sat down at her new desk, the chair ergonomic and more comfortable than anything she had ever owned, and looked at the computer screen displaying the Kane Enterprises logo. She logged in using the credentials Jennifer had provided and began opening files, immersing herself in the language of venture capital, valuations and equity stakes, series funding and exit strategies, terms that were familiar from her abbreviated business degree but felt different now that they represented real companies and real money. She read about a sustainable packaging startup that Enterprises had backed in its infancy and that was now being courted by major corporations. She learned about a telemedicine platform that was revolutionizing healthcare access in rural communities. She studied a portfolio of small hotels that Alexander was transforming into boutique destinations. Each investment reflected a philosophy that valued innovation and social impact alongside profitability, approach that seemed idealistic until she saw the returns each company was generating. By lunch, Maya's head was spinning with information, but she had begun to understand the scope of what Alexander Kane had built. This wasn't just about making money, though there was certainly plenty of that. It was about identifying potential before anyone else saw it, about believing in people and ideas that others, and about having the patience to nurture growth rather than demanding immediate results. It was impressive and intimidating in equal measure, and Maya found herself wondering again why Alexander had chosen to bring her into this world. What he saw in her that justified the risk of hiring someone with no experience in finance or venture capital. She was eating a sandwich at her desk, too nervous to venture out to find lunch and too self-conscious to ask where people went, when Alexander Kane appeared at her workspace. He moved quietly for a man of his presence, and Maya didn't notice him until he spoke. "How's the first day treating you?" She looked up, startled, and felt her face flush. "It's overwhelming but fascinating," she admitted. "There's so much to learn." Alexander nodded, leaning against the edge of her desk with a casualness that suggested this was a normal interaction, not the CEO checking on the newest and least qualified member of his team. "That's good," he said. "The moment you stop feeling overwhelmed is the moment you stop growing. I hired you because I saw something in you that can't be taught, but that doesn't mean there isn't a lot you need to learn. Ask questions, make mistakes early when the stakes are low, and don't pretend to understand something when you don't. Intellectual honesty is just as important as moral honesty." Maya met his eyes, those gray-blue depths that seemed to see too much, and decided to take him at his word about intellectual honesty. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Did you leave that credit card in the booth on purpose?" The question hung between them, direct and challenging. For a moment, Alexander's expression was unreadable, and Maya wondered if she had just committed career suicide on her first day. Then he smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his face from merely handsome to something warmer and more human. "Yes," he said simply, "I did." Maya felt vindication and anger in equal measure. "So it was a test. You manipulated me." Alexander shook his head. "I created an opportunity for you to reveal your character," he corrected. "I didn't manipulate your response. You made a choice, freely and authentically. The fact that I was observing doesn't change the integrity of that choice. You could have kept the card or used it, and I would have been none the wiser if you hadn't called. The test was whether you would do the right thing when you believed no one was watching." "But someone was watching," Maya countered. "You were watching, even if I didn't know it." "That taints the whole thing, does it?" Alexander asked, his tone thoughtful rather than defensive. "If you had known I was testing you, would you have made a different choice?" "No," Maya admitted. "I would have done the same thing." "Then the test was valid," he said. "Look, Maya, I understand why this bothers you. It feels like a violation of trust, and in a way, it is. But I've been doing this long enough to know that people will say anything to get what they want. They'll perform integrity in an interview, tell you they're trustworthy, provide references that swear to their character, but put them in a situation where they can benefit from dishonesty without consequences, and most people will find a way to rationalize taking the easy path. I needed to know that you weren't like most people, and the only way to know that for certain was to test you when you didn't know you were being tested. I apologize if that makes you uncomfortable, but I don't apologize for doing it." Maya sat back in her chair, processing his words. There was a logic to it that she couldn't entirely dispute, even as it still felt wrong on some fundamental level. "And now that I'm here," she asked. Are you still testing me? Alexander's smile returned, softer this time. Every day, he said, but that's true for everyone who works here, including me. I test myself constantly, making sure I haven't lost the values that built this company. The difference is that now you know what I'm doing, so you can make informed choices about whether you want to be part of it. His honesty was disarming, and Maya found herself appreciating it even as she remained wary. I wish you had told me up front, she said, before I accepted the job. Would you have believed me if I had? Alexander asked. If I had called you and said, I deliberately left my credit card to test you and you passed, so I want to hire you, would you have taken the offer seriously, or would you have thought I was either lying or insane? He had a point. The whole thing sounded absurd when stated so baldly. Probably the latter, she conceded. Alexander nodded. That's why I approached it the way I did. I gave you a concrete offer based on an evaluation you didn't know was happening. Now that you're here, now that you've seen what we do and started to understand how we operate, I can be more direct. I brought you here because I believe you have the potential to be exceptional at this work, but more importantly, because I know you have the character to use power responsibly when you eventually have it. Money and influence aren't inherently good or bad. They're tools, and the morality of them depends entirely on the person wielding them. I want to give you those tools, Maya, because I trust how you'll use them. The weight of his words settled over her like a mantle, heavy with responsibility and expectation. You don't even know me, she said quietly. You know one thing about me, one choice I made. How can you be so confident? I'm not confident, Alexander admitted. I'm hopeful. There's a difference, but hope backed by evidence is the foundation of every investment I make. I've been wrong before, I'll be wrong again, but my success rate is high enough that I trust my judgment, and my judgment tells me that you're worth the investment. He straightened up, the casual moment ending as he returned to his professional demeanor. The team meeting is at 2, he said. So I'll see you there. And Maya, welcome to Kane Enterprises. Truly. He walked away, leaving Maya alone with her thoughts and her sandwich and the unsettling realization that she had just been given both an explanation and a warning, that her integrity was now her most valuable asset and her heaviest burden. The afternoon team meeting was held in a conference room with a view that stretched to the horizon, the city laid out below like a map of possibilities. Maya was introduced to her colleagues, a collection of smart, driven individuals who greeted her with polite warmth, but also with the subtle evaluation of people assessing where she fit in the hierarchy. There was Marcus, the lead portfolio manager, a black man in his late 30s with an MBA from Harvard and an easy confidence that came from years of success. There was Priya, a data analyst whose questions during the meeting revealed a mind that saw patterns others missed. There was James, young and eager, recently promoted from an analyst position and clearly hungry to prove himself. And there were others, each occupying their niche in the ecosystem Alexander had created. Alexander himself ran the meeting with a combination of authority and collaboration, soliciting opinions, challenging assumptions, and pushing his team to think beyond the obvious. He was tough but fair, demanding but respectful, and Maya could see why people wanted to work for him. He created an environment where excellence was expected, but mistakes were treated as learning opportunities rather than failure. When he asked Maya to introduce herself, she kept it brief, acknowledging that she was new to venture capital but eager to learn. The team nodded, accepting her presence without hostility but also without particular enthusiasm. She was the unknown variable, and she would have to prove her worth through her work rather than her credentials. As the meeting concluded and people filed out, Maya remained in her seat for a moment, looking out at the city below. She thought about Diego, who would be getting home from school right now, and about her grandmother, who was spending the day at an adult care facility that Maya could now afford without anxiety. She thought about the restaurant where she had worked for 3 years, about the tips she had counted and the feet that had ached and the dreams she had deferred. And she thought about Alexander Kane, a man who had orchestrated her presence in this room through a test she hadn't known she was taking, a man who now held her future in his hand, and she wondered whether she had been rescued or whether she had simply traded one form of servitude for another. Only time would tell. The first month at Kane Enterprises passed in a blur of learning curves and late nights. Maya discovered that her years of juggling multiple responsibilities had prepared her better than she had expected for the demands of venture capital. The attention to detail required in tracking restaurant orders translated surprisingly well to monitoring portfolio performance metrics. The ability to read people's moods and needs, honed through thousands of interactions with diners, helped her understand the dynamics of team meetings and stakeholder calls. And the sheer work ethic that came from years of survival mode meant she could outwork almost anyone in the office when necessary. But knowing she could handle the technical demands of the job didn't make the cultural adjustment any easier. Every day brought small reminders that she was navigating a world whose unwritten rules she didn't fully understand. There was the morning when Marcus offhandedly mentioned his weekend in the Hamptons, and Maya nodded along as though she knew where that was and why it mattered, only to Google it later and discover it was where wealthy New Yorkers maintained summer homes that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. There was the afternoon when Priya invited her to lunch at a French restaurant where the menu had no prices and Maya had to discreetly photograph a dish name to look up later what she had actually eaten. There were the conversations about prep schools and European vacations and family connections that Maya couldn't contribute to, gaps in her experience that marked her as an outsider no matter how well she performed her actual work. She learned to listen more than she spoke, to deflect personal questions with humor, to exist in the spaces between their world and hers without fully belonging to either. But if her colleagues treated her with polite distance, Alexander Kane seemed determined to close that gap through mentorship that bordered on intensive. He had assigned her to shadow Marcus on several portfolio company visits, observing how he evaluated business performance and advised founders. He had given her reading lists of books on venture capital, entrepreneurship, and business strategy, then made time to discuss them with her over coffee in his office. He included her in meetings where her role was simply to listen and learn, exposing her to negotiations and strategic discussions far above her current level. It was the kind of accelerated development that should have felt like an opportunity, and on one level it did, but it also felt like pressure. Like Alexander was investing heavily in her success and would expect significant returns. One Friday afternoon in her 6th week, Alexander called her into his office just as she was preparing to leave for the day. "Maya," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, "I have a proposition." That word again, proposition. And Maya felt her guard rise instinctively even as she took the seat. "One of our portfolio companies is having some operational difficulties," he continued. "It's a small luxury hotel in Vermont, the kind of boutique property that should be thriving but has been struggling with high staff turnover and declining customer satisfaction. The owner is brilliant with vision and terrible with people management. I need someone to go up there for a week, stay at the property, observe the operations, and write me an honest assessment of what's broken and how to fix it." Maya's first thought was that she was completely unqualified for such an assignment. Her second thought was that her years working in hospitality gave her more relevant experience than anyone else on Alexander's team. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you understand service in a way my other analysts don't," Alexander said. "They can read balance sheets and evaluate market positioning, but they've never actually worked in the industry. You have. You know what makes a staff member stay or leave, what makes a customer feel valued or ignored. I need that perspective. Plus," he added with a slight smile, "I want to see how you handle your first independent assignment. Consider it a test, but one where you know you're being tested." The transparency was almost more unnerving than his previous hidden evaluation. "When do you need me to go?" Maya asked. "Tomorrow," Alexander said. "I've booked you a room for 7 nights. Jennifer has your itinerary and travel arrangements. Use this time to observe, to ask questions, to dig into what's really happening beneath the surface. Then come back and tell me the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Especially if it's uncomfortable. The owner's a friend, and I've been hesitant to be too critical, but the business is hemorrhaging money and I need an outside perspective unburdened by personal loyalty." That night, Maya broke the news to Diego and their grandmother over dinner. A week in Vermont sounded like a vacation, but Maya knew it would be anything but. She would be working constantly, evaluating every interaction, every detail, carrying the weight of responsibility for an assessment that could determine the future of a business and the jobs of everyone who worked there. "It's a good sign," Diego said, his face lighting up. "He wouldn't send you if he didn't trust your judgment. Just don't overthink it. You know hospitality better than anyone. Trust what you see." Her grandmother, having one of her clearer days, squeezed Maya's hand. "You've always had good eyes, Mia," she said in Spanish. "You see what others miss. Use that gift." The hotel was called the Birchwood Inn, a converted mansion from the early 20th century nestled in the mountains with views that belonged on postcards. Maya arrived Saturday morning to find a property that was beautiful but fraying at the edges, like an aging actress refusing to acknowledge the passage of time. The gardens were immaculate, but the paint on the window frames was peeling. The lobby chandelier sparkled, but the upholstery on the chairs showed wear. The staff greeted her with professional smiles that didn't reach their eyes, the kind of forced pleasantness that came from working under stress. She checked in using the reservation Alexander had made under her name, noting how the front desk clerk fumbled with the computer system, muttering under her breath about software that never worked properly. The room was lovely, decorated with antiques and local art, but Maya noticed the details that guests weren't supposed to see: the dust on the baseboards, the water stain on the ceiling corner, the towels that were clean but threadbare. She unpacked quickly and then did what she had done countless times at the Grandview. She put on comfortable shoes and started walking the property with the observant eyes of someone who had lived hospitality from the inside. She watched the housekeeping staff struggle with ancient vacuum cleaners and inadequate cleaning supplies. She observed the kitchen team working in cramped conditions with equipment that should have been replaced years ago. She noticed how the staff seemed to avoid the manager, a stern woman in her 50s who barked orders and accepted no question. By Sunday afternoon, Maya had identified the core problem: the owner, a man named Richard Thornton, who Alexander had described as brilliant with vision, had invested every dollar into the guest-facing aesthetic while completely neglecting the infrastructure that supported it. His staff worked with inadequate tools, insufficient training, and under the leadership of a manager who treated them as disposable rather than valuable. The high turnover wasn't mysterious. It was inevitable. People didn't leave good jobs. They left bad bosses and impossible working conditions. And when staff were constantly turning over, guest service suffered because no one had the experience or institutional knowledge to deliver excellence. Maya spent the week documenting everything. She interviewed staff members during their breaks, asking questions that made them realize she understood their world because she had lived it. She reviewed financial records that Richard provided, seeing how money had been allocated to designer furniture while the boiler was held together with improvised repairs. She observed guest interactions, noting when service failures occurred and tracing them back to systemic problems rather than individual incompetence. And she formulated recommendations that she knew would be uncomfortable for Richard to hear but necessary for him to implement if the Birchwood Inn was going to survive. On her last night, Richard invited her to dinner, clearly hoping to charm her into a favorable report. He was in his early 60s, handsome in a weathered way, dressed in expensive casual clothes that marked him as someone with money, if not necessarily business acumen. Over wine that cost more than Maya used to make in a day at the Grand. He talked about his vision for the property, his love of hospitality, his commitment to creating a destination that honored the building's history. He spoke beautifully and passionately, and Maya understood why Alexander liked him. But passion without operational competence was just expensive dreaming. Mr. Thornton, Maya said when he finally paused for breath, "Can I be direct with you?" Richard smiled indulgently. "Of course. That's why Alexander sent you, is to give me the unvarnished truth. Your hotel is failing not because your vision is wrong, but because you're not investing in the people who have to execute that vision," Maya said. "Your staff are working with equipment from the last century. They're managed by someone who treats them as problems rather than assets, and they have no incentive to stay or to care about your dream. You've built a beautiful stage, but you've given your actors no support. Until you fix that, no amount of designer furniture is going to save this place." Richard's smile faded, replaced by something defensive. His staff were paid competitive wages, he protested. He provided benefits. They should be grateful. "Grateful doesn't pay for the emotional cost of being treated poorly," Maya countered. "I've worked in hospitality for years. I know what makes people stay and what makes them leave. Money matters, but respect matters more. Training matters. Having the right tools to do your job matters. Your front desk clerk is struggling with a reservation system that crashes twice a day. Your housekeepers are using vacuum cleaners that are older than I am. Your kitchen staff are working in conditions that would barely pass health inspection. And your manager, with all due respect, is driving away every talented person you hire within 3 months. You can't build excellence on a foundation of neglect." Conversation ended awkwardly, with Richard thanking her stiffly for her candor and excusing himself early. Maya returned to her room knowing she had just made an enemy of one of Alexander's friends, but she had told the truth as she saw it, which was what she had been asked to do. She spent the evening writing her report, documenting her observations with specific examples and concrete recommendations. She didn't sugarcoat the findings, but she tried to present them constructively, showing Richard a path forward rather than just cataloging his failures. It was past midnight when she finally sent the report to Alexander, attaching it to an email that simply said, "Here is my honest assessment as requested. I hope it's useful." She lay in bed afterwards, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she had just committed career suicide. If Alexander valued his friendship with Richard more than he valued honest analysis, she had just proven herself to be more liability than asset. If Richard complained about her findings or her approach, Alexander might decide she lacked the diplomatic skills necessary for client relations. She'd been asked to tell the truth, but there was always a gap between what people said they wanted and what they actually wanted to hear. Maya had learned that lesson 1,000 times in her years of service work, had perfected the art of honest feedback delivered in palatable ways. But this time she had chosen directness over diplomacy, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The next morning, as she was packing to leave, her phone rang. It was Alexander. "Maya," he said without preamble, "I've read your report. It's excellent. Thorough, insightful, and exactly what I needed. Richard called me an hour ago furious, which tells me you told him things he didn't want to hear but needed to. That takes courage. Well done." Maya felt relief wash over her, followed immediately by a new understanding. This had been another test, not of her analytical skills, but of her willingness to tell uncomfortable truths to powerful people. She had been set up to succeed by being herself, by applying the hard-won wisdom of her previous life to the challenges of her new one. And she had passed, though she was starting to realize that in Alexander Kane's world, every success was just the setup for the next, more difficult test. 3 months into her position at Kane Enterprises, Maya had settled into a rhythm that felt almost sustainable. The cultural gaps that had initially seemed insurmountable became familiar territory to navigate. She learned to dress the part, investing some of her new salary in a wardrobe that allowed her to blend in rather than stand out. She learned the language, the casual references to business concepts and cultural touchstones that marked insider status. She learned to contribute to conversations without oversharing, to project competence without arrogance, to exist in this world of privilege while maintaining connection to the world she came from. Diego was thriving with the financial pressure lifted, his grades improving now that he didn't have to work part-time jobs. Their grandmother had been moved to a better care facility where the staff knew her name and treated her with dignity. The transformation in their lives was so complete that sometimes Maya had to remind herself it had only been a few months, that this security was still new and potentially fragile. At work, she had carved out a niche as the team member who could bridge the gap between financial analysis and operational reality. Marcus increasingly relied on her to evaluate the human elements of potential investments, to assess whether founders had the leadership skills to build teams and scale operations. Priya collaborated with her on due diligence, combining data analysis with Maya's intuitive read of organizational culture. Even James, who had initially seemed to resent her rapid integration into the team, had warmed to her after she helped him salvage a presentation by pointing out how his recommendations would actually play out in practice versus how they looked on paper. She was becoming valuable, not despite her unconventional background, but because of it. Alexander continued to mentor her with an intensity that felt both generous and demanding. Their weekly one-on-one meetings had evolved from simple check-ins to deep strategic discussions where he pushed her to think bigger, to consider not just immediate problems but systemic solutions. He was teaching her to see patterns, to understand how seemingly unrelated pieces of information connected into larger narratives, to anticipate consequences that others missed. It was exhilarating and exhausting, like being trained by someone who believed you were capable of more than you had ever imagined for yourself. But there was also something unsettling about the relationship, a dynamic that Maya couldn't quite name. Alexander was unfailingly professional, never crossing boundaries, never making her uncomfortable in the ways she had learned to guard against in her years of service work. Yet she felt increasingly that she was being shaped for some purpose he hadn't yet revealed, that all of this investment in her development was building towards something specific. The answer came on a Friday in early December, when Alexander asked her to stay late for a conversation that couldn't wait until Monday. The office had emptied out, people escaping early for weekend plans, leaving just the two of them and the city lights spreading out below like promises. Maya, Alexander began, sitting not behind his desk but in one of the chairs facing the window, gesturing for her to take the seat beside him. I want to talk to you about your future here. Over the past 3 months, you've exceeded every expectation I had. You learn quickly, you think critically, and most importantly, you maintain your integrity even when it would be easier or more profitable to compromise. That matters more than you realize. Maya waited, sensing that this was preamble to something significant. I'm creating a new position, Alexander continued, a role that doesn't currently exist in our structure. I'm calling it Director of Ethical Investment, and I want you to fill it. The title meant nothing to Maya, but she could hear in his tone that it meant something to him. What would that entail? She asked. Your job would be to ensure that every investment we make aligns not just with our financial goals but with our stated values, Alexander explained. You would have veto power over deals that you believed were ethically problematic regardless of their potential returns. You would develop frameworks for evaluating the social impact of our portfolio companies. You would be the conscience of this firm, the voice that asks the uncomfortable questions before we commit capital. It's a significant responsibility and it comes with significant authority. You would report directly to me and your recommendations would carry weight with our partners. The scope of what he was offering took Maya's breath away. This wasn't just a promotion, it was a fundamental reshaping of her role in the company. Why me? She asked, the question that seemed to define their entire relationship. Why not Marcus or Priya? Or someone with more experience? Because Marcus thinks primarily in terms of returns and Priya thinks primarily in terms of data, Alexander said. They're both excellent at what they do, but neither of them instinctively asks whether we should do something just because we can. You do. You come from a world where choices have immediate and visible consequences, where cutting corners means someone gets hurt. That perspective is exactly what this firm needs as we grow and take on larger, more complex investments. Maya looked out at the city, at the lights that represented millions of lives being lived in circumstances ranging from desperate to comfortable, and felt the weight of what was being offered. This was power, real power, the ability to influence where hundreds of millions of dollars flowed and how they shaped the world. It was also an enormous responsibility, the kind that came with consequences for getting it wrong. What if I make the wrong call? She asked quietly. What if I reject a deal that turns out to be profitable and someone else funds it and succeeds? What if I approve something that looks ethical but has unintended negative consequences? Then you'll learn from it, Alexander said simply, and you'll make better decisions going forward. Maya, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be thoughtful and honest. That's all anyone can do. The financial metrics are easy. We have algorithms and analysts and decades of market data to guide those decisions. But the ethical questions, those require human judgment, and they require someone whose judgment I trust. You've proven to me repeatedly that you can see beyond your own self-interest, that you're willing to tell difficult truths, even when they're costly. That's rare, and it's exactly what this position requires. Maya felt something shift inside her, a recognition that this was the moment her life had been building towards since she found that black card in booth 7. Every test, every challenge, every uncomfortable situation had been preparing her for this, for the responsibility of wielding influence in service of something larger than herself. When do you need my answer? She asked. Take the weekend, Alexander said. Think about what it means, talk to the people you trust, and give me your decision Monday morning. The salary for the position is $180,000 annually with performance bonus, and you'll have a seat at the partners table for all investment decisions. It's a significant step up from where you are now. That night, Maya took the subway home in a daze, barely noticing the familiar rhythms of the commute. She arrived at their apartment to find Diego studying at the kitchen table and her grandmother asleep in her room, and she felt the dissonance between the quiet domestic scene and the magnitude of what had just been offered to her. Diego looked up from his textbooks, saw her expression, and immediately closed his laptop. "What happened?" he asked. Maya sat down across from him and told him everything, watching his face light up with pride and excitement. "This is incredible," he said when she finished. "Maya, do you realize what this means? You're going to be making decisions that affect real companies, real people. You can actually make the world better, but what if I'm not ready?" Maya asked, voicing the fear that had been building since Alexander made his offer. "What if I mess up, if I let him down or make the wrong call on something important?" Diego reached across the table and took her hand, his grip firm and steady. "You've been ready for this your whole life," he said. "Everything Mom and Dad taught us about doing what's right even when it's hard. Everything you've learned from working your way up from nothing. It all prepared you for exactly this moment. And yeah, you'll probably make mistakes, but you'll make them honestly and you'll learn from them. That's more than most people in positions of power can say." Maya spent the weekend wrestling with the decision, though she knew from the beginning what her answer would be. She visited her grandmother's care facility, sitting with the woman who had helped raise her and holding her hand while she slept. She thought about her parents, about what they would say if they could see where she had ended up, about whether they would be proud or worried or both. She thought about all the waitresses and busboys and housekeepers she had worked alongside, people who were just as smart and hardworking as anyone at Kane Enterprises, but who had never been given a chance to prove themselves in a different context. She thought about the responsibility of being someone who had escaped and the obligation that came with it to use her platform for more than just personal advancement. Monday morning, she arrived at the office early and went directly to Alexander's door. His assistant hadn't arrived yet, but his light was on and Maya knocked softly. "Come in," he called, and she entered to find him already at his desk, coffee in hand, looking as though he had been there for hours. She didn't sit down, didn't waste time with preamble. "I'll take the position," she said, "but I have conditions." Alexander raised an eyebrow, a slight smile playing at his lips. "I'm listening." "If I'm going to be the ethical conscience of this firm, then I need real authority, not just the appearance of it," Maya said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "That means when I say no to a deal, it stays no unless you can convince me otherwise with arguments about ethics, not just potential returns. That means I get access to all due diligence materials, all stakeholder discussion, everything. No decisions made in rooms I'm not in. And that means you have to be willing to lose profitable opportunities if they don't align with our values, even when it costs us." Alexander stood, walked around his desk, and extended his hand. "Agreed," he said. "All of it. That's exactly the kind of authority I meant you to have. Welcome to the leadership team, Maya." She shook his hand, feeling the warmth of his grip and the weight of the commitment she had just made. As she turned to leave, he called after her. "Maya, one more thing." "Yes, thank you," he said simply, "for being exactly who I hoped you would be when I left that card in the booth, for not disappointing my faith in you." Maya met his eyes, those gray-blue depths that had evaluated and challenged her from their first meeting. "I hope I never do," she said quietly, and walked out to begin a new phase of her life, carrying the hopes and expectations of a man who had given her everything and the responsibility to prove that his faith had been justified. Maya's first 2 months as director of ethical investment were a baptism by fire. Alexander had made her transition public within the firm through a company-wide announcement that positioned the new role as a strategic priority rather than a symbolic gesture. The response from her colleagues was mixed. Marcus congratulated her warmly and seemed genuinely pleased to have another voice at the leadership table. Priya was more reserved but professional, asking thoughtful questions about how they would collaborate going forward. But there were others, particularly some of the senior analysts and junior partners, who made their skepticism clear through pointed comments and barely concealed eye rolls. She had been with the firm for less than 6 months, had no formal training in finance or ethics, and was now being given authority to override their recommendations. The resentment was understandable, even if it was frustrating. Maya responded by working harder than anyone else, arriving early and staying late, reading everything she could find on corporate social responsibility and impact investing and ethical frameworks. For business decisions, she reached out to professors at business schools who specialized in these areas, attended conferences where she was often the youngest and least credentialed person in the room, and built a network of experts she could consult when facing complex questions. She developed evaluation rubrics for assessing potential investments, creating frameworks that translated abstract ethical principles into concrete criteria. And she learned to defend her positions with data and logic rather than just moral conviction, knowing that in a world of hard-nosed investors, appeals to conscience alone would never be enough. Her first major test came in the form of a pharmaceutical startup called Vital Cure. The company had developed a promising treatment for a rare autoimmune disease, and early clinical trials showed remarkable efficacy. The founders were brilliant researchers with impeccable credentials, and the market opportunity was substantial. Marcus brought the deal to the investment committee with an enthusiastic recommendation, projecting returns that would make Vital Cure one of their most successful investments. The entire team was eager to move forward, seeing it as exactly the kind of innovative, life-changing technology that Kane Enterprises should support. But when Maya reviewed the business plan, she found something that made her deeply uncomfortable. The proposed pricing strategy for the treatment put it out of reach for the vast majority of patients who would need it, making it accessible only to those with premium insurance or significant personal wealth. At the investment committee meeting where Waitress was being presented, Maya sat quietly through Marcus's pitch and the enthusiastic discussion that followed. The numbers were compelling, the science was sound, and the potential to help people with a devastating disease was real. But when Alexander turned to her and asked for her ethical assessment, Maya took a breath and delivered the verdict that she knew would be unpopular. "I can't support this investment as currently structured," she said clearly. "The pricing model is predatory. This treatment could change lives, but only for people who can afford to pay $250,000 annually. That's not healthcare innovation, that's wealth-based rationing of medical care. The company projects that less than 10% of patients who need this treatment will actually receive it. We would be profiting from a system that denies care to the most vulnerable." The room went silent. Marcus's expression darkened, and Maya could feel the weight of disapproval from around the table. "Maya," Marcus said with forced patience, "this is how pharmaceutical development works. The R&D costs are enormous. The regulatory pathway is expensive, and companies need to recoup their investment. If we don't fund this, someone else will, and those patients will still be priced. At least if we invest, we have a seat at the table to potentially end future pricing decisions. It's not ideal, but it's reality." "But we're not required to participate in that reality," Maya countered. "We can choose to invest in companies that build different models, that prioritize access alongside profit. Waitress has made a conscious choice to maximize returns by pricing out 90% of potential patients. That's a values decision, not a market necessity, and it's one I can't endorse." One of the junior partners, a man named Steven, who had been particularly dismissive of Maya's appointment, leaned forward with barely concealed contempt. "So you're saying we should reject a deal that could return 10 times our investment because you don't like their pricing? We're a venture capital firm, not a charity. Our job is to generate returns for our investors, not to solve society's problems." "Those two goals aren't mutually exclusive," Maya shot back. "Our stated values include social impact. If we only apply those values when they're convenient or profitable, then they're not values at all, they're marketing copy. I'm not saying we should be a charity. I'm saying we should refuse to profit from business models that depend on excluding people who desperately need help." The argument escalated, with voices rising and frustrations spilling out. Steven accused Maya of naive idealism that would cost the firm millions. Marcus tried to find a middle ground, suggesting they could invest with conditions around future pricing adjustment. Priya pointed out that their analysis showed VitalCure would dominate the market regardless of whether Kane Enterprises participated, so refusing to invest would be symbolic at best. Maya held her position, her voice steady even as her heart pounded. She had been given authority for exactly these situations, and backing down now would render that authority meaningless. Finally, Alexander, who had been listening to the debate without intervening, held up a hand for silence. The room immediately quieted, all eyes turning to him. "Maya's right," he said simply. "This deal doesn't align with our values. We're passing." The words fell like a hammer, definitive and final. Steven's face flushed red. Marcus looked stunned. The rest of the team exchanged glances that ranged from confused to resentful. But Alexander's decision was absolute, and the meeting moved on to other business, leaving Maya feeling vindicated and isolated in equal measure. She had won the battle, but she had made enemies in the process, colleagues who now saw her as an obstacle to their success rather than a valuable team member. The cost of integrity, she was learning, was often measured in relationships as much as in dollars. After the meeting, Alexander asked Maya to stay behind. When they were alone, he walked to the window and stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city. "That was well done," he said. "You made the right call, and you defended it effectively." Maya joined him at the window, still feeling the adrenaline of the confrontation. "I'm not sure everyone else sees it that way," she said. "Steven looked like he wanted to throw me out the window." Alexander smiled slightly. "Steven is ambitious and smart, but he lacks the long-term vision necessary for leadership. He sees each investment as an isolated transaction rather than a reflection of who we are as a firm. You see the bigger picture, and that's why you're valuable. But Maya, I need you to understand something. The path you've chosen, the role you've taken on, it's going to be lonely. You will make decisions that cost this firm money. You will say no to deals that your colleagues are passionate about. You will be blamed when opportunities slip away, and rarely credited when your caution prevents disasters. That's the nature of being the ethical voice in a room full of people optimizing for profit." Maya absorbed his words, understanding that this was both validation and warning. "Can you tell me something honestly?" she asked. "When you offered me this position, did you expect it to be this hard? Did you know what you were asking me to take on?" Alexander turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I knew exactly what I was asking," he said. "I built this firm on certain principles, but as we've grown and brought in more partners and analysts, I've watched those principles get diluted by pragmatism and rationalization. I needed someone who hadn't been corrupted by years in this industry, someone who still believed that doing the right thing mattered more than maximizing returns. You're not here to make everyone comfortable, Maya. You're here to make us better, even even when better is harder and less profitable. That makes you unpopular sometimes, but it also makes you essential. The conversation should have been reassuring, but Maya felt the burden of it settling more heavily on her shoulders. She was being positioned as the guardian of Alexander's vision, the person who would say no when everyone else wanted to say yes. It was a powerful position, and a profoundly isolating one. That evening, she met Diego for dinner at a restaurant neither of them could have afforded 6 months earlier. Over pasta and wine, she told him about the Vital Cure decision, about the confrontation in the committee meeting, about the look she had received from colleagues who now saw her as an adversary. Diego listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think you made the right call?" he asked. "I know I did," Maya said, "but knowing you're right doesn't make being disliked any easier." Diego set down his fork and looked at her with the kind of serious intensity that reminded her he wasn't the kid brother she had been protecting for years, but a young man with his own hard-won wisdom. "Maya, you spent 3 years working yourself to exhaustion to take care of me and Grandma," he said. "You gave up your own dreams so I could have mine. You know what the cost of sacrifice is? What it means to do the hard thing because it's the right thing? This job, this position Alexander gave you, it's not a gift, it's a responsibility. And responsibilities come with costs. But you don't get to choose integrity only when it's convenient. You taught me that. Every time you went to work exhausted, every time you paid a bill instead of buying something for yourself, every time you put us first, you were teaching me that doing right matters more than being comfortable. Don't lose that now just because the stakes are higher." His words hit her with the force of recognition. She had been so focused on the discomfort of being unpopular, on the tension with her colleagues, that she had lost sight of why she had accepted this role in the first place. She wasn't here to win popularity contests. She was here to ensure that the resources being deployed by Kane Enterprises were used in ways that honored the struggles of people like her family. People who didn't have the luxury of wealth to cushion them from bad corporate decisions. The Vital Cure founders would get funded by someone, that was true, but it wouldn't be with money that Maya had any influence over. She could only control what happened within her sphere of responsibility, and in that sphere she had drawn a line and held it. Over the following weeks, the tension in the office gradually eased as the team moved on to other deals, and Maya proved that she wasn't opposed to all investments, just those that violated clear ethical principles. She approved several promising companies that Marcus brought forward, worked collaboratively with Priya on due diligence that balanced financial and social impact metrics, and even found common ground with Stephen on a renewable energy investment that satisfied both profit and purpose. Slowly, grudgingly, her colleagues began to accept that her role wasn't about obstruction, but about ensuring that their investments reflected their stated values. The resentment didn't disappear entirely, but it evolved into a kind of wary respect. An acknowledgement that Maya took her responsibilities seriously and couldn't be pressured into compromising. But Maya knew that the real test was still coming. The Vital Cure decision had been significant, but it had been relatively straightforward, a clear case of predatory pricing that violated basic principles of healthcare access. What would happen when she faced a situation where the ethical lines were blurrier, where reasonable people could disagree about the right course of action? What would happen when the stakes were even higher, when saying no meant real consequences not just for the firm but for people whose livelihoods depended on the investments Kane Enterprises made? Maya had proven she could hold a line when that line was obvious. The question that kept her awake at night was whether she could navigate the gray areas with the same clarity and conviction, and whether Alexander's faith in her would survive the inevitable moment when her judgment failed or when the cost of her integrity became too high for even him to accept. The gray area Maya had been anticipating arrived 6 months into her role as Director of Ethical Investment, wrapped in the form of a company called Meridian Technologies. On the surface, Meridian was exactly the kind of investment Kane Enterprises should embrace. The company had developed artificial intelligence software that streamlined hiring processes, using algorithms to screen resumes and identify top candidates more efficiently than human recruiters. The technology was impressive, the market opportunity was enormous, and the founding team included former executives from major tech companies with proven track records. Marcus presented the deal with genuine enthusiasm, and even Priya's data analysis showed strong indicators for success. The company was already profitable, growing rapidly and seeking capital to scale nationally. It seemed like a straightforward decision, the kind of win that satisfied both financial and ethical criteria by helping companies find talent more effectively. But when Maya dug deeper into Meridian's methodology, she found troubling patterns in the data. The AI algorithm, trained on historical hiring data from thousands of companies, had learned to replicate existing biases rather than eliminating them. Candidates from certain zip codes were systematically downgraded in rankings. Resumes with names that suggested ethnic minorities received lower scores. Women applying for technical positions were filtered out at higher rates than equally qualified men. The algorithm wasn't overtly discriminatory, it didn't explicitly consider race or gender. but it had absorbed the prejudices embedded in decades of human hiring decisions and was now automating that discrimination at scale. Meridian's founders genuinely believed they were creating a meritocratic system, and in many ways they were improving efficiency. But they had failed to recognize that efficiency built on biased data simply made injustice more systematic and harder to challenge. Maya brought her concerns to Alexander in a private meeting before the investment committee would formally consider the deal. She laid out the data she had compiled, showing him example after example of how Meridian's algorithm produced disparate outcome. Alexander listened carefully, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. "This is more complicated than VitalCure," he observed. "The founders aren't intentionally creating a discriminatory system. They're trying to solve a real problem, and they're genuinely unaware of these patterns." "Yes," Maya agreed, "which makes it harder but not less important. Intent doesn't erase impact. If we invest in Meridian as currently structured, we're funding a system that will scale discrimination across hundreds or thousands of companies. The fact that it's unintentional doesn't make the people who get filtered out any less unemployed." Alexander stood and walked to his window. A habit Maya had learned signaled that he was working through a complex problem. "Here's what complicates this," he said slowly. "Meridian's CEO is Tyler Chun. We go back 15 years. He gave me one of my first major opportunities when I was building this firm, connected me with investors and opened doors that might have stayed closed. He's a good man, and this company represents years of his work. If we pass on this investment, I'm not just turning down a deal. I'm telling a friend that his life's work is fundamentally flawed." Maya felt a chill of recognition. This was different from VitalCure, where the founders had been strangers and the ethical failure had been clear. This was personal for Alexander, and she was being asked to evaluate whether her principles should override his loyalty and potentially his judgment. "Can we invest conditionally?" Maya asked. "Require them to audit and correct the algorithmic bias before we commit capital." Alexander shook his head. "Tyler's proud and he's confident in his system. If we suggest there's a problem, he'll see it as an accusation of racism, which will destroy our relationship. And if we're wrong, if these patterns are statistical noise rather than genuine bias, we'll have damaged his reputation and our own credibility for nothing. Are you certain about your analysis?" Maya met his eyes. "I'm certain the patterns exist," she said. "I'm certain they replicate historical discrimination. Whether that meets the legal definition of bias is something lawyers could argue about. But ethically, I don't think we should be funding a system that produces these outcomes, intentional or not." The investment committee meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon, and Maya spent the intervening hours refining her analysis and preparing for the arguments she knew were coming. She ran additional statistical tests, consulted with experts in AI ethics and employment law, and built the strongest case she could that Meridian's technology, despite its efficiency gains, created unacceptable risks. But she also understood that she was challenging not just a business deal, but Alexander's personal relationship and his own judgment. This wasn't about her authority in the abstract. This was about whether Alexander would honor the role he had created when doing so cost him something personally meaningful. When the committee convened, Marcus presented Meridian with the same enthusiasm he had shown in preliminary discussions. The financial projections were solid, the market validation was strong, and the technology genuinely improved hiring efficiency for the companies using it. Then Tyler Chun himself joined the meeting via video conference, a charismatic man in his early 40s who spoke passionately about his vision for revolutionizing talent acquisition and making hiring more objective and fair. He talked about eliminating human bias, about giving candidates from non-traditional backgrounds a fair shot, about using technology to create opportunity. Maya listened to him and understood why Alexander valued his friendship. Tyler believed deeply in what he was building, and his intentions were genuinely good. That made what she had to do even harder. When it was her turn to present her ethical assessment, Maya projected her analysis onto the conference room screens, walking the committee through the patterns she had identified. She showed them the statistical disparities, the zip code correlations, the name-based filtering, all presented with the clinical precision of data rather than the heat of accusation. Tyler's face on the video screen shifted from confidence to confusion to defensiveness. "That's not how the algorithm works," he protested. "We specifically designed it to ignore demographic factors. You're seeing correlations that don't reflect causation, but the outcomes are what matter," Maya countered gently. "Even if the algorithm doesn't explicitly consider race or gender, it's producing racially and gender disparate results. That means it's learning bias from the training data. The historical hiring decisions you fed it were made by humans with biases, and your AI has systematized those biases." Tyler's response was immediate and heated. "You're accusing me of building a racist system," he said, his voice tight with anger. "That's not just wrong, it's offensive. I've spent years working on this, and I've been more thoughtful about fairness than most companies in this space. You're cherry-picking data to support a predetermined conclusion." Maya felt the room's attention shift, people leaning away from her position as Tyler's passion and Alexander's friendship with him created an emotional counterweight to her analysis. "I'm not questioning your intentions," Maya said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm showing you outcomes that your system produces. Those outcomes will hurt people, particularly people from communities that have already faced discrimination. We have an opportunity to pause, to audit the algorithm, to fix these issues before scaling them across thousands of companies. That seems like the responsible choice. But Tyler wasn't interested in pausing. If you don't believe in what I've built, then don't invest, he said flatly. But don't pretend this is about ethics when it's really about risk aversion and political correctness. My system is better than human recruiters, more fair and more consistent. If there are statistical anomalies, they're artifacts of the data, not flaws in my approach. I'm not going to delay my growth plans or waste resources on an audit to satisfy someone who doesn't understand the technology. He logged off the call abruptly, leaving an awkward silence in the conference room. Alexander's expression was carefully neutral, but Maya could see the tension in his jaw, the deliberate control he was exerting over his reaction. The committee debated for another hour, with positions becoming entrenched and emotions running high. Stephen seized the opportunity to attack Maya's analysis as technically unsound, arguing that she was overstepping her expertise. Marcus tried to find a middle ground, but ultimately supported moving forward with the investment, arguing that they could address bias concerns after funding. Priya remained neutral, acknowledging the statistical patterns Maya had found, but uncertain whether they rose to the level of disqualifying the deal. The room was splitting along lines of those who prioritized the financial opportunity and relationship with Tyler versus those who found Maya's ethical concerns compelling. And at the center of it all was Alexander, the final decision maker, being forced to choose between a friend and the principles he had hired Maya to uphold. Finally, Alexander called for a break, asking everyone except Maya to leave the room. When they were alone, he didn't speak immediately, just stood at the window with his back to her, and Maya could feel the weight of what this decision was costing him. I brought you here to be the conscience of this firm, he said finally, still not turning around. I told you that you would have authority to veto deals on ethical grounds. I meant that, but Maya, you need to understand what you're asking me to do. Tyler isn't just a friend, he's someone I owe. When this firm was struggling, when I was one bad quarter away from shutting down, he connected me with the investors who saved us. He believed in me when no one else did. Telling him no, especially on grounds that he sees as an attack on his integrity, that doesn't just cost us this deal. It costs us that relationship and potentially others in our network who will see me as disloyal. Maya stood and walked to stand beside him at the window, both of them looking out at the city below. I understand what I'm asking, she said quietly. And I understand that it's not fair to you that you're being asked to choose between loyalty and principle. But Alexander, you didn't hire me to make easy calls. You hired me to make the right calls even when they're painful. If we invest in Meridian knowing that their system perpetuates discrimination, then all of our stated values about ethical investing become meaningless. We're just another firm that talks about doing good while profiting from systems that do harm. I can't support this investment, and I don't think you really want me to. The silence stretched out between them, and Maya realized that this was the true test, not just of her integrity, but of Alexander's. He had created this role and given her authority, but creating structures was easy when they aligned with your interests. The real measure of whether those structures meant anything was what happened when they conflicted with what you wanted. If Alexander overruled her now, if he chose Tyler's friendship over her ethical assessment, then her position would be revealed as symbolic rather than substantive, and she would have to decide whether she could continue working in a role that was ultimately powerless. Alexander turned to face her, and she saw in his eyes something she hadn't expected. Not anger or resentment, but a kind of weary respect. You're right, he said simply. We're passing on Meridian. I'll call Tyler personally and take full responsibility for the decision. I won't throw you under the bus or hide behind your assessment. He deserves to hear from me that I chose principles over friendship, even if he never forgives me for it. Maya felt relief and sadness in equal measure. Relief that Alexander had honored the role he had created and the authority he had granted her. Sadness that doing the right thing required causing him pain and potentially costing him a valued relation. Thank you, she said quietly. I know what this costs. Alexander smiled, but it was a sad smile. Everything worthwhile costs something, Maya, he said. You've known that longer than I have. The question is never whether there's a cost. The question is whether you're willing to pay it. He walked back toward the door, then paused. You should know. Whatever happens with Tyler, I don't regret hiring you or giving you this authority. You're exactly who I hoped you would be, and that's worth more than any deal, no matter how profitable. The fallout from the Meridian decision rippled through Kane Enterprises and beyond in ways Maya hadn't fully anticipated. Tyler Chun did exactly what Alexander had feared. He took the rejection personally and publicly. Within a week, he had given an interview to a prominent tech publication where he characterized Kane Enterprises as having abandoned its commitment to innovation in favor of performative political correctness. He never mentioned Maya by name, but anyone in their industry knew who had driven the decision, and the article sparked debates in venture capital circles about whether ethical oversight was necessary guidance or unnecessary interference. Some investors reached out to Alexander expressing support for his principled stance. Others questioned whether Kane Enterprises was becoming too risk-averse, too concerned with optics over returns. The firm's reputation for being both profitable and principled, carefully cultivated over years, was suddenly subject to scrutiny and skepticism. Inside the office, the atmosphere shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Maya noticed colleagues who had warmed to her over previous months now maintaining professional distance, as though proximity to her might taint them with responsibility for the controversial decision. Conversations would pause when she entered common areas, then resume with careful neutrality that felt more isolating than outright hostility. Even Marcus, who had been supportive of her role, seemed more guarded in their interactions. His enthusiasm for bringing deals to her for ethical review noticeably diminished. The message was clear. Maya had won the battle over Meridian, but at a cost that extended beyond Alexander's friendship with Tyler. She had demonstrated that her authority was real, which meant people now understood that crossing her or dismissing her concerns carried genuine consequences. That made her powerful, but also made her lonely. Diego noticed the change in her when she came home after particularly difficult days. Her usual resilience worn thin by the constant low-grade stress of being simultaneously essential and resented. "You're carrying too much weight," he told her one evening when he found her staring at her laptop screen without actually reading what was displayed there. "You're taking responsibility not just for your decisions, but for how everyone else feels about them. That's not sustainable." Maya knew he was right, but knowing didn't make the burden lighter. She had discovered that integrity at this level wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic stands. It was about the daily grind of holding positions that made you unpopular, of defending decisions that cost you relationships, of living with the knowledge that doing the right thing sometimes meant accepting that people would judge you harshly for it. 3 months after the Meridian decision, Alexander called Maya into his office for what she expected would be their regular weekly meeting. Instead, she found him with Jennifer and another woman she didn't recognize. A black woman in her 50s, with an air of quiet authority that immediately commanded respect. "Maya," Alexander said, gesturing to the visitor, "this is Dr. Patricia Lawrence. She's a professor of business ethics at Columbia and one of the leading voices in responsible investing. I've asked her to conduct an independent evaluation of our ethical investment framework and your performance in this role. I thought you might want to know what someone outside our firm thinks of what we're trying to do here." The next several hours were the most intense professional examination Maya had ever experienced. Dr. Lawrence reviewed every decision Maya had made since taking the position, asking probing questions about her reasoning, her methodology, and her decision-making process. She interviewed other members of the team, reviewed documentation, and examined the frameworks Maya had developed. It felt like being dissected. Every choice and judgment exposed and evaluated by someone with decades of expertise. Maya answered honestly, defending her decisions when she believed they were sound and acknowledging uncertainties when they existed. By the time Dr. Lawrence finished, Maya felt emotionally exhausted and uncertain whether she had passed or failed some test she hadn't known she was taking. 2 days later, Alexander asked Maya to join him for lunch, something he had never done before. They went to a quiet restaurant far from the financial district, a place where they wouldn't encounter colleagues or clients, and over simple food in a corner booth that reminded Maya oddly of where this had all started. Alexander shared Dr. Lawrence's report. "She was impressed," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "Not just with your decisions, though she found those generally sound, but with your process. She said you've developed an ethical framework that's both principled and pragmatic, that you're willing to engage with complexity rather than retreating into absolutes. According to her, we're doing something here that most firms only pretend to do, actually integrating ethical considerations into investment decisions in ways that have teeth. She thinks you're exceptional at this work, Maya, and she's recommending that we expand your role in your team." Maya opened the folder and scanned the report, seeing Dr. Lawrence's formal assessment written in academic language but unmistakably positive. She felt vindication, but also a stirring of apprehension. Expanding her role meant more responsibility, more decisions, more opportunities to face the kind of conflicts that the Meridian situation had created. "I need to tell you something," Maya said, setting down the report. "I'm not sure I want this job to get bigger. I'm not even sure I want this job anymore. Not the way it's evolved. The cost of being right all the time, of being the person who says no. It's exhausting in ways I didn't anticipate. I miss being part of a team rather than being the person the team resents. I miss feeling like my colleagues are friends rather than people I have authority over. I miss not carrying the weight of other people's livelihoods in every decision I make." Alexander listened without interrupting, his expression sympathetic but not surprised. "I wondered when this conversation would come," he said. "You've been carrying more than anyone should have to carry alone. That's why I'm proposing we build you a team, hire additional people who can share the load, create a department rather than making you a solo voice. But Maya, before you make any decisions about your future here, I need you to understand something about why I created this position in the first place. It wasn't just about making Kane Enterprises more ethical. It was about making me more ethical." He leaned back, his usual composed facade cracking slightly to reveal something more vulnerable underneath. "When I built this firm, I had clear principles about how I wanted to do business," Alexander continued. "But as we grew and became more successful, I felt those principles erode. Not dramatically, not in ways I could point to and say that's wrong, but gradually, imperceptibly, death by 1,000 small compromises. I would approve deals that made me uncomfortable because the returns were too good to pass up. I would overlook ethical circle red flags because confronting them would cost relationships or opportunities. I was becoming the kind of investor I had always disdained, the kind who talks about values but acts purely on profit motive. I needed someone who would hold me accountable, who would force me to live up to the standards I claimed to have. That's why I tested you with the credit card. I wasn't just evaluating whether you were honest. I was looking for someone whose integrity was stronger than my pragmatism. Someone I couldn't talk out of doing the right thing when doing the wrong thing would be easier. The admission was more honest than Maya had expected, and it reframed everything she had experienced over the past year. You didn't just hire me to evaluate deals, she said slowly. You hired me to evaluate you. Alexander nodded. And you've done that better than I could have hoped. The Meridian decision, that hurt. Losing Tyler's friendship, dealing with the criticism, watching some of our network question our judgment, all of that was painful. But it was also clarifying. You showed me that I had given you real authority, and then you forced me to honor that authority when it cost me something I valued. That's what integrity looks like, Maya, not when it's convenient, but when it's expensive. And watching you bear that cost, seeing how hard it's been on you, that's made me realize I can't ask you to carry this burden alone. We need to build something sustainable, something that doesn't depend on one person being willing to be unpopular. Maya felt tears prick her eyes. The emotional armor she had been maintaining for months, suddenly too heavy to hold. I found your credit card in a booth 7 months ago, she said, her voice thick. And somehow that led to this, to me sitting across from you in a restaurant wondering whether I have the strength to keep doing what you hired me to do. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been easier if I had just kept the card, taken the money, and never entered this world at all. At least then I wouldn't know what it costs to try to change things from the inside. Alexander reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a gesture of solidarity rather than romance. But you didn't keep the card, he said gently. You made the hard choice then, and you've been making hard choices ever since. That's who you are, Maya. And yes, it costs you, but it also creates value that can't be measured in dollars. Every person who doesn't get discriminated against by Meridian's algorithm because we refuse to fund it. Every patient who might get access to affordable treatment because we rejected Vitalcure's predatory pricing. Those are real impacts. You don't see them because they're absences rather than presences. Problems that didn't happen rather than successes you can point to, but they matter. They sat in silence for a moment, the restaurant's gentle ambient noise filling the space between them. You said you're building me a team, Maya finally said. Who did you have in mind? Dr. Lawrence, for one, Alexander replied. She's interested in leaving academia to do this work in the real world. She would bring credibility and expertise that would make your positions harder to dismiss. I'm also talking to 2 other candidates, people with backgrounds in different industries who understand both the financial and human dimensions of what we're trying to do. And I'm going to make this initiative more visible externally. Let the world know that Kane Enterprises is serious about ethical investing, and that we're investing resources to back that commitment. That should help with the internal dynamics, make it clear that this isn't just Maya Torres being difficult, but rather the firm's strategic direction. The vision he was describing was compelling, a way to move from isolated crusade to institutional commitment. But Maya had learned enough over the past months to know that structures and teams didn't eliminate the fundamental challenges. Someone still had to make the final call on difficult decisions. Someone still had to bear the weight of unpopular choices. If I stay, she said carefully, if I agree to build this team and expand this work, I need you to promise me something. Alexander met her eyes. Name it. Promise me that you'll keep challenging me the way I challenge you, Maya said. That you'll push back when you think I'm wrong. That you won't let me become so rigid in my principles that I lose sight of the real-world impact of my decisions. I don't want to be the ethics police who everyone fears. I want to be part of a conversation about how we can do well and do good simultaneously. That requires me to stay humble and open to being wrong, and I need you to help me with that. Alexander smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it was a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. I promised, he said. And Maya, thank you. Not just for staying, but for being exactly the person I hoped you would be when I left that card in the booth. You've changed this firm, and you've changed me. That's worth every difficult conversation and every lost opportunity. They finished their lunch talking about logistics and plans for the new team. But underneath the practical discussion was a deeper understanding. They had entered into a partnership that transcended typical employer-employee relationships. They were trying to build something rare in the world of high finance, a firm that measured success not just in returns, but in the integrity of how those returns were achieved. It was an ambitious, difficult, and perhaps impossible goal. But as Maya walked back to the office beside Alexander, feeling the weight of her responsibility, but also the support of someone who believed in the same vision, she thought that maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. 18 months after Maya Torres found a black credit card wedged in a booth cushion, she stood on a stage at a venture capital conference delivering a keynote address to an audience of investors, founders, and industry leaders. The girl who had once served coffee to wealthy patrons was now being introduced as a pioneer in ethical investing, the director of impact and integrity at one of the most respected firms in the industry. As she looked out at the sea of faces, Maya felt a surreal disconnect between who she had been and who she had become. But underneath that surrealism was something more solid, the knowledge that she had earned this position not through connections or credentials, but through the consistent application of principles she had learned long before she ever entered the world of venture capital. The speech she delivered that day wasn't about theory or abstraction. Maya told stories, real stories from her 18 months at Kane Enterprises, about the deals they had rejected and why, about the difficult conversations and the costs of integrity. She talked about Vitalcure and Meridian, not naming the companies but describing the ethical dilemmas they had presented. She spoke honestly about the loneliness of being the person who says no, about the toll it takes to hold unpopular positions, about the doubt that creeps in when you wonder if you're being principled or just stubborn. But she also talked about the companies they had funded, businesses that were profitable precisely because they had built ethical practices into their foundations, founders who had appreciated being pushed to think more deeply about their impact and who had built better companies as a result. The response was divided, as Maya had expected. Some in the audience embraced her message, seeing it as a necessary evolution in how venture capital operated. Others were skeptical or openly dismissive, viewing ethical oversight as a luxury that only successful firms could afford, or as a constraint that would inevitably limit returns. But the conversation had begun, and that was what mattered. Kane Enterprises was no longer an outlier quietly trying to do things differently. They were publicly advocating for a model that integrated ethics into investment decisions, and other firms were starting to pay attention. Some because they believed in the approach, and others simply because they recognized that the culture was shifting and they needed to adapt. After her speech, Maya was approached by a young woman who looked to be in her early 20s, dressed in clothes that Maya recognized as the uniform of people working multiple jobs to make ends. Professional but not expensive, carefully chosen to project competence on a limited budget. The woman introduced herself as Carmen, a recent college graduate working as an administrative assistant at a startup while trying to break into the venture capital industry. "I wanted to thank you," Carmen said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, "for what you said up there about coming from outside this world. I've been to a dozen of these conferences and everyone talks like the only path into venture capital is through elite schools and family connections. You're the first person I've heard acknowledge that there's value in experience that doesn't come from privilege. It matters to hear that. It makes me think maybe I have a chance." Maya looked at this young woman and saw herself 18 months earlier standing outside that glass tower in the financial district and wondering if she belonged. She pulled out her business card and wrote her personal email on the back. "Send me your resume," she told Carmen. "We're building a team, and we're specifically looking for people who understand the real-world impact of business decisions because they've lived it. I can't promise you a job, but I can promise you that your application will get serious consideration based on who you are and what you bring, not where you went to school or who your parents know." Carmen's eyes filled with tears and she clutched the card like it was a lifeline. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." But Maya did know, because she had been there, had felt that same desperate hope that someone would see her potential rather than just her lack of conventional credentials. And in that moment, she understood something profound about the ripple effects of the choice she had made in that diner booth. By returning Alexander's card rather than using it, she had set in motion a chain of events that extended far beyond her own life. She had created a model that demonstrated value and integrity, and now she was in a position to open doors for others the way Alexander had opened them for her. The cycle of opportunity was expanding, and she was no longer just a beneficiary but an architect of that expansion. That evening, Maya met Alexander for dinner at an upscale restaurant, a celebration of the successful conference appearance and the growing recognition of their work, over wine that Maya could now afford but still appreciated with the consciousness of someone who remembered calculating whether she could buy groceries and medication in the same week. They reflected on how far they had come. Dr. Lawrence had joined the team 6 months earlier and was proving to be an invaluable partner, bringing academic rigor and institutional credibility to their ethical framework. 2 other hires had followed, building out the department into something sustainable and sophisticated. The internal resistance that had been so pronounced after the Meridian decision had gradually given way to acceptance and even occasional enthusiasm as the team saw that their ethical approach wasn't hurting returns, but actually enhancing their reputation and deal flow. Alexander raised his glass in a toast. "To integrity," he said, "and to the person who reminded me what it costs and why it matters." Maya clinked her glass against his, feeling the weight of sentiment and gratitude. "To second chances," she countered, "and to people who are willing to invest in potential rather than just proven track records." They drank, and then Alexander reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something Maya hadn't seen in over a year: the black credit card. the Obsidian Elite card that had started everything. He placed it on the table between them, and Maya stared at it, feeling a rush of memory and emotion. "I've been carrying this with me today," Alexander said, "knowing you were giving that speech. I wanted to remind myself of where this all started, of the moment when a waitress I had never met made a choice that changed both of our lives." Maya picked up the card, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the night she had held it and felt the pull of temptation, the possibility of solving all her problems with a single selfish decision. "It feels like a lifetime ago," she said softly, "like it happened to someone else." "In many ways it did happen to someone else," Alexander observed. "You're not the same person who found that card, and I'm not the same person who left it. We've both been changed by what followed, challenged and pushed and forced to grow. That card was a test, but it turned out to be a test for both of us, not just you." Maya nodded, understanding the truth of that statement. She had been tested by the temptation to take what wasn't hers, and she had passed. But Alexander had been tested by his willingness to honor the role he had created even when it cost him personally, and he had passed too. Their partnership had been forged through mutual testing and mutual respect, through the shared experience of choosing integrity over expediency. As they finished dinner and prepared to leave, Alexander gestured to the card still sitting on the table. "Keep it," he said, "not to use, obviously, but as a reminder. When things get difficult, when you're facing another impossible decision, wondering if holding your principles is worth the cost, look at that card and remember that every choice cascades forward in ways we can't predict. You chose to return it, and that choice created opportunities not just for you but for everyone you'll now have the chance to help. That's the real power of integrity, Maya. It compounds over time, creating value that extends far beyond the immediate transaction." Maya slipped the card into her purse, feeling both the physical weight of it and the metaphorical weight of what it represented. She thought about Carmen clutching a business card with the same hope that Maya had felt when Alexander offered her a chance. She thought about Diego, now thriving in his engineering program with the financial stability to focus on his studies rather than survival. She thought about her grandmother, spending her final years in comfort and dignity rather than in the anxiety of inadequate care. And she thought about all the decisions still to come, the investments she would evaluate, the ethical lines she would draw, the uncomfortable conversations she would have. The work was far from over. But she was no longer doing it alone, and she was no longer doing it as the uncertain outsider hoping to prove herself worthy. She had proven that repeatedly, and now she was building something that would outlast her individual contribution. Walking out of the restaurant into the cool evening air, Maya pulled out her phone and sent a quick email to Carmen. "I meant what I said about sending me your resume," she wrote. "We're always looking for people who understand that business decisions have human consequences. If you're interested, let's talk about what opportunities might exist." She hit send and smiled, imagining Carmen's reaction when she checked her email and realized that the offer had been genuine, that the door that had seemed permanently closed might actually be opening. This was how change happened, not through grand gestures or revolutionary manifestos, but through individual choices that accumulated into something larger, through people who had been given chances choosing to extend those chances to others. The black card sat in her purse as she rode the subway home, past the stop where she used to get off for her shifts at the Grandview Hotel, past the neighborhoods where she had struggled and survived. She was heading to a nicer apartment now in a safer area, but she made this commute deliberately, refusing to insulate herself from the world she had come from. She needed to remember what it felt like to count pennies and make impossible choices, to carry the weight of other people's well-being on exhausted shoulders. That memory was what kept her honest, what prevented her from becoming someone who spoke about ethics from a position of comfort without remembering what it cost to live them from a position of desperation. Maya Torres had found a black card and returned it when she could have kept it, and that single act of integrity had unlocked a future she couldn't have imagined. But the real story wasn't about the reward she had received. It was about what she had done with that reward, how she had transformed an act of personal integrity into a platform for systemic change. She had been given a second chance, and she was using it to create second chances for others. That was the legacy she was building, one decision, one person, one opportunity at a time. And it all traced back to a moment in a diner booth when a poor waitress looked at temptation and chose honor instead. When a billionaire tested a stranger and found someone who would change his life as much as he changed hers. If this story of integrity, transformation, and the profound impact of choosing what's right over what's easy has moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that character matters more than circumstances. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about real people facing real choices and discovering that the most valuable things in life can't be bought or borrowed, only earned through the consistent application of principles that define who we are when no one is watching. Click the notification bell so you never miss a story that reminds us all that every choice we make is a vote for the kind of world we want to live in, and that sometimes the smallest acts of integrity create the largest ripples of change.